Not taxing the rich leads to communism and revolutions, even when the economy is improving. Sounds kind of contradictory, doesn't it? A quick example: the French Revolution. Before the French Revolution, the elite were not taxed. Well, you can't tax them. They're the ones that are importing these raw materials to make jobs, and they're paying people to fix their chateaus up, and they're spending money on art. And they, if you tax them, they can't do those things. They can't create those jobs. Taxes are to be paid by the local baker and the local butcher. What jobs are they creating but their own? Sounds kind of familiar, kind of rhymes a little bit with some things we hear today. Here is a psychological factor important with regard to revolutions. We base our happiness on what we see around us, what we can compare ourselves to. So, people say today, people, they have air conditioning, they have televisions. Life is so much better today than it was 100 years ago. Well, I didn't live 100 years ago, so I can't really compare my life to someone from 100 years ago. I don't see that. But I do see what my neighbor has. And this is where we kind of run into the Easterlin paradox. Now, you've probably heard money doesn't buy happiness. Oh, money buys happiness, up until a certain point. And beyond that point, we can become unhappy based on what we compare ourselves to. So I think the study now has it at about $100,000 within the US. Your happiness goes up once you hit about $100,000. More money will not necessarily make you any more happy. But as you continue to make money, if people around you are more wealthy, or even at that whatever level you are, if the people around you have much greater income, that can make you unhappy. If they weren't around, you might be perfectly content with what you have. All right, that's the Easterlin paradox. And it affects the very wealthy as well. The wealthy are notoriously unhappy. The extremely wealthy are notoriously unhappy. They have, their $10 million yacht, but their neighbor has a $100 million yacht with a helicopter, and makes them unhappy. And it's easy to kind of roll our eyes at it, but it's a real phenomenon. The elite-funded neoliberal reaction to wealth inequality is to say, the wealth inequality, people not becoming wealthy, is due to regulations or taxes. So if we get rid of the regulations and if we get rid of the taxes, then these people, the regular people, they would have more money. They could buy a home, they could buy a new car, they could start a business. It's all because of the government taxation that they're not able to do these things. But the markets are already cornered, and monopolies in place are not going to allow for most regular people to claw their way up. Now, of course, there are exceptions, people that get lucky or are well connected or have just a particularly ingenious idea. There are always exceptions to the rule. But for the most part, no. Things are not going to improve for most people based on lowering taxes and cutting some obscure regulations. We've been cutting taxes, especially on the wealthy, for years now, and trying to roll back many regulations, and we haven't really seen any reduction in wealth inequality. In fact, we've seen it get worse. Yet the argument is to continue and try harder, I guess. So you'd think we would have figured out by now that cutting taxes is not the solution to wealth inequality. There's another factor that brings about revolutions, and this is one that the left can sometimes get a little more uncomfortable dealing with, and that has to do with cultural change and economic change, mass migration, shifts in social values, and also economic growth, changes in the economy, moving from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, or an industrial economy to a service economy. Whenever that happens, you have winners and losers. And the existence of people that are losing out is creating instability, frustration, and anger. When you have new demographics and new kind of social ideas about, sometimes people get uncomfortable with that. Whether or not they should or shouldn't is an entirely different story. They do. The US economy has grown tremendously in the last 50 years. But what does that matter to me if I can't put gas in the car? That's kind of what we're seeing. We're saying, yes, there's great growth, there's great wealth, but the regular person doesn't have it. So that's creating an instability and an anger, especially if then they can look at people who are doing exceptionally well. Now, we can see historically the intersection between social change and economic growth mixed with the Easterlin paradox to create the Iranian Revolution. So, Iran, before the Islamic Revolution, had an economy that was growing rapidly. And socially, it was changing. You may have even seen like these pictures going on social media of women in Iran in bikinis and such. It was a liberalizing country. The Iranian passport was quite powerful. It rivaled that of any nation in Western Europe. Yet, people were upset because there was wealth inequality and there was winners and losers. And that was really kind of the big thing. Yes, the economy was growing, yes, but a lot of people didn't really feel like they were winning in that deal. So they kind of got Easterlin paradoxed into wanting a change, wanting a rebellion. The Islamicists didn't like all the social and cultural changes, so they were inclined to rebellion. They made an arrangement, so the Islamicists and the left teamed up. And we can kind of see that today on some issues where arguably Islamicists and the left have kind of made common cause with each other. Well, this happened in Iran, and they were successful at overthrowing the Shah. And as soon as the revolution succeeded, it became the Islamic Revolution, and they got rid of the leftist. Like the French Revolution, the communist revolutions in Russia and China were related to how taxation worked. In Russia, the big tax was on salt. Well, the poor, the regular people, they needed salt to live. They needed to preserve their food to survive the winter. There was discussion of perhaps having something like an income tax where the wealthy could, pay money. But no. We're going to keep things the way they are. So the poor had to pay, literally to survive the winter. And we can see how that ended up working out for the Russian Tsar and that system. Clearly burdening the poor with the cost of government while they watch the wealthy being taxed less proportionally, living in luxury. Clearly this is not a sustainable model or hasn't worked out historically. Yet we continue to do it. The only way it is sustainable is with oppression or some levels of brainwashing. You can convince the people that a sort of hierarchy is necessary, that it's ordained by God, or that it's whatever hierarchy exists or whatever you're suffering, it's for the greater good. People will suffer a lot for the greater good. The French, Chinese, and Russian revolutions are all directly related to the elite not paying a fair share of taxes. Society changing, modernizing, industrializing, and the working class not feeling like they were getting a fair share of the growth in the economy. And as a result of the revolutions that followed, millions died. And the Russians and the French tried exporting the revolutions as well, causing untold death and tragedy. Fascism is a slightly different bear. At first, elites will try to use the power of the media, the power of the press, to control the narrative, to imply that, as mentioned before, low taxes, we should be left alone. Any sort of taxation is tyranny and authority, and will be turned against you, the common people, so you should be leaving us alone. But a critical mass of people stop believing that. And once that critical mass is reached, fascists get a little bit worried. I should say the oligarchs get a little worried and decide to make common cause with the fascist. They'd rather have a fascist government than actually pay taxes to the people. Oh, the tyranny of the masses, as they might fear. So the narrative moves away from absolute freedom or low taxation to more along the lines of what we consider fascist ideology. Oh, our problems. Ooh, they focus on the social issues. Our problems are related to immigrants, mass immigration, social changes, the destruction of the family, or just people who are different. So things that are quite often linked to revolutions. Focus in on those things. They'll also address some economic issues and usually say about how some group is cheating you economically. It's some group that's the cause of your economic pain. And, Germany, it was largely considered the Jews. Now in the U.S., they're talking about, well, it's China's fault. And, people will be, our country's been treated unfairly with trade, and that's why you're not doing so well. So, the fascists will harp on economic and social change as the cause of people's unhappiness, and they're not necessarily entirely wrong with some of the things they may be saying or some of the things they're pointing out. which gives them just that grain of credibility they need for people to jump on the bandwagon. But they don't address the root causes of the disparity. And they come up with solutions that may be almost cliched. They sound kind of good at first, but if you really analyze them, they don't really play out and don't quite work and won't work. Now, also, very importantly, is at this point that the corporations merge, essentially the oligarchs, merge with the government itself. Now, in democracy, any democracy, the government can be captured, which is essentially that nothing can be voted in without at least the tacit approval of the business elites or oligarchs. But in fascism, these oligarchs and the government are essentially the same. It's almost as if any sort of, elections are now completely a pretense. So they form a clientelism. And in clientelism, the institutions, universities, schools, businesses, corporations that go along with the regime and support the regime and follow the regime's orders, they are allowed to stay in business. They can have their business license. They may be able to avoid regulations. They can receive grants. They can receive tax benefits. They can receive subsidies. But the businesses that don't go along with the regime, or the universities that don't go along with the regime, they may not receive grants. They may not receive tax cuts. Sound familiar? In this scenario, the regular people, they may be thrown some bones. They might get college tuition covered. Industry needs workers, so sometimes the industry will say, all right, well, let's make sure that our workers get trained. And so, but anything that the people would be getting positive under a fascist government isn't anything they couldn't have gotten otherwise under a democratic regime. The people also get told how special they are and how anything they are suffering is because they are special and targeted. And it gives meaning to that suffering. And they can also be told that suffering is for the greater good, or perhaps even ordained by God, as mentioned before. People will suffer if they are brainwashed or believe it serves some purpose. Now, with this talk of like corporations and kind of hinting at free markets or libertarianism, I find it fascinating that Soviet analysts pointed out that fascism was like libertarianism taken to its logical extreme. And I'll explain. They pointed out that the SS, this is really more Himmler and his crew, what they wanted to do was eliminate the state altogether and replace it with a series of clan corporations that would control certain areas, kind of like fiefdoms. And the clan corporation would basically be a replacement for the tribes of old. So it's kind of cyberpunk, but agrarian, something like that. So if you want to stop fascist or communist rebellions, you should probably tax the rich.